The summer heat in the Atlantic cargo hold felt almost solid, a heavy, suffocating presence that clung to every inch of skin and fabric. 84 women sat crammed together on the floor, backs against the metal hull, knees pulled tightly to their chests. Their uniforms, once sharp and official, were now limp with sweat and fear. Most kept their eyes down, lips pressed tight, as if words might bring punishment. The air smelled of rust, diesel, and something deeper: uncertainty. Among them sat Hilda Landt, a former train conductor turned army cook. Her hands, calloused and raw from years of labor, clutched the hem of her skirt where she had sewn a secret pocket. Inside it was a small, circular compact mirror, scratched, faded, but intact. It was the last piece of her before the war. Not a weapon, not propaganda, just a sliver of a past life. She hadn't looked at herself in months, afraid of what she'd see. Rumors swirled like smoke around her in hushed German whispers. "The Americans shave women's heads," someone said. "They parade prisoners through their cities in rags," another added. Hilda listened silently, not contributing. She had learned to be wary of those who shouted the loudest. Fear had a way of dressing itself up as conviction. She didn't believe everything they said, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had no expectations of mercy. The war had taught her that uniforms erased individuality, and as a woman in a gray tunic marked enemy, she expected only punishment. What she feared most wasn't pain, it was erasure, becoming invisible, becoming a body without a name, a face without meaning. The ship rocked slightly beneath them, a dull rhythm that had become a strange kind of comfort. Hilda's thoughts drifted to the last time she wore makeup. It had been in Tunisia, right before their retreat. She'd stolen 5 minutes to sneak into a Red Cross tent, applied a soft red shade to her lips, and stared into a mirror while bombs echoed in the distance. She hadn't smiled then. She had simply needed to remember that she was still there, still someone. Now, sitting in a dark cargo hold far from home, she felt stripped of even that fragile identity. They were no longer women. The war had decided. They were symbols, tools, threats. And yet, her fingers still found the outline of the hidden mirror beneath her dress. Just knowing it was there made her feel a fraction less hollow. No one knew where they were being taken. The guards on the ship spoke little. They gave food, water, but no answers. Some of the women speculated they were being sent to forced labor camps. Others believed they'd be executed quietly and forgotten. Hilda tried not to imagine either outcome. She focused on the texture of metal under her legs, the rhythm of breath beside her, and the weight of the mirror. When the announcement came, landfall approaching, the silence became more intense. One by one, the women stood and gathered their things. Boots scraped against metal, knees cracked from stiffness, but no one complained. There was nothing left to say. The hatch opened, and blinding sunlight poured in, as if trying to erase the darkness they carried. Texas, a word she had only seen on maps, now a horizon filled with dust and heat. As the women descended the gangplank, Hilda looked out and thought only of one thing. Whatever waited beyond this dock, she would try, somehow, to hold on to the face she remembered, even if the world no longer recognized it. The heat hit her first, thick, dry, and heavy, as if the Texas sun had teeth. Hilda squinted against the brightness, her eyes unprepared after weeks in shadow. The sky above them stretched endlessly, an oppressive blue that made her feel even smaller. Dust clung to her boots with every step, coating her skin, her lungs, her thoughts. This was not what she had imagined a prisoner's arrival would look like. There were no dogs barking, No guards screaming orders. The American soldiers who escorted them wore olive uniforms and blank expressions. Their rifles were slung casually, not aggressively. One of them offered water from a canteen without a word. The gesture was so alien, so gentle, that it made Hilda flinch. The camp emerged from the dust like something out of a dream. Neatly lined barracks stood behind chain-link fences, their wood painted a cheerful pale yellow. There were no searchlights, no towers, just a quiet efficiency. Laundry fluttered on lines, and flower beds bloomed near doorsteps. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt, bizarrely, like a village. Hilda kept waiting for the performance to drop. Perhaps this was a show for their arrival, a false piece to catch them off guard. Her fingers twitched with unease as she walked through the gates in formation, counting her breaths. The women around her murmured in confusion, eyes darting. No one cursed at them. No one laughed. No one pointed. They were directed toward the intake building as if they were simply new arrivals, not enemies. Inside, the building smelled of paper and soap. A long table divided the room, with American women seated behind clipboards and piles of forms. Red Cross armbands were visible on several sleeves. Hilda took her place in the line, heart pounding. She had heard that intake was the moment of humiliation, stripped, searched, interrogated. Instead, she was asked for her name, age, and occupation. The woman opposite her spoke soft, careful German. Hilda struggled to meet her gaze. Then came the inspection of belongings. A canvas bag was handed over, its contents spilled on the table. A spoon, a comb, a photo of her father, and the compact mirror she had hidden in her uniform seam. Her breath caught in her throat. She expected the mirror to be taken, confiscated, destroyed, mocked. But the Red Cross woman simply picked it up, turned it over in her hand, and gave a faint smile. "You can keep it," she said in German. "Geneva rules say you may retain personal items." She slid the mirror gently back across the table. Hilda took it without a word. The moment passed, but it branded itself into her memory. That night, lying in a real bed with sheets and a clean pillow, Hilda stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind outside. The room was quiet, with the low sounds of breath and distant crickets. Her mirror sat beside her on the small wooden shelf. She hadn't opened it yet. She was afraid of what she might see. But the fact that she still had the choice, that it was hers again, unsettled her more than anything else. Around her, women whispered questions into the dark. Was this a trick? Would it change? Would kindness morph into punishment once their guards relaxed? But Hilda's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about that mirror, that moment of unexpected mercy. It wasn't what she had been told to expect, and it made her wonder what else she had been wrong about. Days in the camp began to settle into a strange rhythm. Wake-up call at dawn, roll call in the courtyard, simple breakfast served in tin trays, followed by assigned work shifts. Hilda was placed in the kitchen detail, helping prepare meals for both the German prisoners and the American staff. The work was monotonous but familiar, peeling potatoes, washing trays, stirring soup in large steel pots. In the routine, there was safety, a kind of mental escape. But it wasn't the labor that disturbed her. It was the absence of cruelty. No one shouted, no one struck anyone. The guards were present but distant, performing their duties with a kind of bored detachment. Some even offered polite nods when passing by. For women who had prepared for hatred, this calm was disarming. Hilda found herself watching the American women with a quiet fascination. The nurses, the Red Cross workers, even the cooks wore small traces of color, lipstick, a hint of blush, a light curl in the hair. It wasn't vanity, it was ritual, a subtle way of saying, "I am still myself." It made Hilda ache with something she couldn't name. Then, in early October, a new delivery arrived. The announcement came during the evening meal, a shipment from the Red Cross containing hygiene supplies donated by civilian groups. When the translator listed the items, murmurs rippled through the hall. Soap, toothbrushes, combs, and then, to everyone's astonishment, lipsticks, powder compacts, hand creams. The room fell silent. It was the kind of silence that wasn't disbelief, but paralysis. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a low wave of whispering began, some voices angry, others incredulous. The concept was too foreign to process. Makeup? Offered to prisoners? To enemy women? Later that night, the supplies were laid out in the mess hall, neatly arranged on folding tables. Each woman could take 1 or 2 items. Hilda stood in line, heart pounding with confusion and guilt. Around her, the reactions varied. Some women refused outright. Others grabbed quickly and slipped the items into their pockets. A few, like Hilda, moved forward slowly, unsure whether this was a trap or a gift. At the table, she saw it. A slim, dark red lipstick. Not flashy, not bold, but deep and quiet in its shade. Her hand hovered. Across from her stood the same Red Cross worker who had returned her mirror. She said nothing, just met Hilda's eyes and gave the smallest of nods. Hilda took the lipstick and stepped away, her fingers trembling. That night, back in the barracks, the debates began. Some women called it manipulation, a tactic to weaken them, make them forget who they were. Others whispered that it was the first act of dignity they'd been offered in years. Hilda sat in silence, the lipstick in her palm. She felt as if she were holding something sacred and dangerous at once. Later, when the lights were out and the barracks had quieted, Hilda slipped into the latrine. There, beneath the dim bulb above the cracked mirror, she opened the lipstick. Her hand shook as she brought it to her lips. The motion was slow, deliberate. When she looked at her reflection, fragmented, distorted, she saw not a soldier, not a prisoner. She saw a woman. She stood there for a long time, eyes locked on the face in the glass. The color on her mouth was soft, barely noticeable, but it was hers. It didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean forgiveness. It meant she still existed beneath the uniform, beneath the shame. It was the first time in 3 years she felt like her face belonged to her again. A month passed, and the lipstick remained hidden in Hilda's locker, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She didn't use it often, only in quiet moments when no one was watching. It wasn't about vanity, it was about reclaiming something she thought was gone forever. The ability to choose, to shape her own face, even in a place where identity was supposed to be stripped away. But the act didn't go unnoticed. Tension began to build in the barracks, not from the guards, but from within. Some of the women, especially those who held fast to their loyalty to the Reich, saw the makeup as betrayal. They claimed it softened them, made them forget what side they were on. One woman in particular, Ute, grew louder in her disapproval with each passing day. Ulite had been a signal operator in France, known for her strict discipline and fierce rhetoric. She accused the makeup wearers of surrendering not just to the enemy, but to weakness. In her view, accepting kindness from Americans was equal to collaboration. She called it a poison wrapped in a smile. And for women desperate to hold on to any piece of pride, her words struck chords. The barracks split into factions. Some women kept wearing the makeup, defiantly or quietly, while others refused to even touch the donated items. Whispers replaced conversation. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. Hilda tried to stay quiet, but she felt the weight of every glance, every pause in conversation when she entered a room. Then came the announcement that letters home were now permitted. 1 page, reviewed by censors, routed through Switzerland. For many, it was a lifeline, a chance to reconnect with family, with a version of themselves that existed before the war. But for Hilda, it felt like an impossible task. How could she write a single page that told any meaningful truth? She sat on her bunk for hours, pencil in hand, staring at the blank sheet. Her mother was likely still alive, perhaps her sister too. But what could she say? That she was being treated humanely? That she wore lipstick again? That the enemy had shown her more dignity than some of her own? The words refused to come. Eventually, she wrote something simple. That she had food, that she was alive, that the sun in Texas was unrelenting. She ended the letter with a line she hadn't dared write since her capture. "I still remember my face." It was vague enough not to trigger the censors, but to her, it held everything. The next day, one of the younger women, Marta, was caught reading a portion of her letter aloud, proudly describing the kindness she had experienced, the hygiene supplies, even the occasional laughter. Ute heard it. Her response was swift and violent. She tore the page from Marta's hands and called her a traitor. That night, Ute stood in the center of the barracks, waving the torn letter as if it were evidence in a trial. "This is how it starts," she hissed. "This is how they turn us into puppets." No one moved to stop her. The fear was palpable. She turned her gaze on Hilda, then, without warning, lunged for her footlocker. The lipstick fell out, rolled across the floor. Ute snatched it up with disgust, raising her boot as if to crush it. But Hilda stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. Their eyes met, anger against restraint, rage against weariness. For a moment, neither moved. Then an older woman spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "It's just color," she said, "but it reminds us we're not just uniforms." The moment broke. Uta backed away, breathing hard. The lipstick was returned to Hilda's hand. That night, the barracks were silent. The argument had left a scar, but also a truth exposed. Wearing lipstick wasn't surrender. It was resistance of a different kind. A refusal to be reduced, to be erased. And in a place designed to strip them of everything, that refusal was dangerous and necessary. In late January, the routine of the camp was interrupted by a notice posted in the mess hall. All prisoners were to report for a mandatory assembly that evening. No details were given. Speculation spread quickly. Some feared repatriation, others imagined collective punishment. Hilda tried to remain calm, but the unease spread through the barracks like a fever. The unknown always weighed heavier than the known. At dusk, the women filed into the hall, rows of benches arranged in silence. A projector had been set up at the front. A white sheet hung on the wall, swaying slightly from a draft. The camp commander appeared, flanked by 2 Red Cross officials. His expression was heavy, almost somber. Through a translator, he told them they would be watching newsreel footage from Europe, footage of recently liberated camps. The lights dimmed, and the reel began. At first, it showed fences, gates, train tracks. Then the camera moved inside. What followed was a slow, relentless assault of images. Piles of corpses, skeletal figures barely alive, mass graves, gas chambers. Women began to sob. Others sat frozen. Some turned away, burying their faces in their hands. But Hilda stared straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had heard rumors. Everyone had. But to see it, frame after frame, was to feel the ground shift beneath her feet. The voices in the film were cold, documentary-like, counting bodies, showing townspeople forced to confront what had been done in their name. Hilda's throat burned, her chest tight. Shame rose in her like bile, not just for what her country had done, but for her own blindness. When the lights came back on, no one spoke. The silence was different now, thick, suffocating, irreversible. The commander said only one thing before leaving. "This is what the world saw, and now you've seen it too." Women began to file out slowly, some shaking, others hollow-eyed. Hilda walked as if underwater, her ears ringing. Outside, the cold air stung her skin. She stood beneath the stars, trying to breathe. In her pocket, the lipstick felt like lead. Something that once meant defiance now felt almost obscene. How could she wear color when the world had turned gray with ash? She felt the urge to throw it away, to bury it in the dirt, to erase the part of her that had believed she still deserved beauty. Later that night, the barracks were unusually still. No whispers, no footsteps. Just quiet breathing and the occasional stifled sob. Hilda sat on her bunk, staring at her reflection in the compact mirror. She looked older, thinner, more fragile than she remembered. But it was still her. That was the most painful part. She hadn't changed, not really. The world had. The world had. She thought of the women in the footage, their empty eyes, their stripped identities. She thought of her own confusion and silence in the early years of the war, the way she had accepted the slogans, the speeches, the pride. She thought of the lessons she never questioned. Now, every word of that past echoed like betrayal. She had not built the camps, but she had lived in the same silence that allowed them to exist. In the corner of the room, Ute sat with her head in her hands. Others lay curled in their blankets, awake but still. No one looked at each other. They had all seen too much. The lipstick sat beside Hilda's pillow, untouched. She didn't know if she would ever wear it again. But for now, it stayed. Not as defiance, not as decoration, but as a reminder. A symbol of the person she was before, and the choice she had to make about who she would be now. The days that followed the screening passed in a fog. The routine remained the same: meals, work detail, inspections. But something had shifted irreversibly inside the women. Where there had once been quiet conversation and even small moments of laughter, now there was only silence. The barracks felt like a tomb. Women walked with their eyes lowered, afraid to look at one another, as if their faces might betray their thoughts. Hilda moved through the days like a ghost, performing her duties but feeling disconnected from her own body. She stopped opening the compact mirror. The lipstick remained buried at the bottom of her locker, wrapped once again in cloth, untouched. She could no longer bring herself to wear it. It felt like a lie now, a memory from a time that no longer belonged to her. Letters from home began arriving in small batches. Some women wept as they read. Others didn't open theirs at all. Hilda received a letter from her sister, written in careful script, filled with restrained relief. She mentioned that their mother was alive, that the city was in ruins, but they had survived. At the end, a single sentence: "I hope you are still you." Hilda stared at those words for hours. She found herself one afternoon behind the laundry shed, where Ute sat alone in the shade. The proud, defiant woman now looked sunken, her hands wrapped around her knees. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Ute whispered that her family had died in the Dresden bombings, that she had clung to loyalty, to belief, because it was all she had left, and now even that had turned to ash. Hilda reached into her pocket and held out the lipstick, her fingers trembling. "It's not about forgetting," she said softly. "It's about choosing to be human again." Ute didn't take it, but she didn't reject it either. She simply looked at it for a long time, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a weapon or a symbol, but as something fragile, something red, something real. That night, a few women gathered in the yard for a quiet memorial. They didn't speak of nations or guilt or sides. They spoke of the dead, of what had been lost, and of what might still be worth saving. One of them read a poem in German, her voice shaking. Another laid a flower on the ground. There was no forgiveness spoken, but in the silence there was acknowledgement. In early May, word reached the camp: the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Some women cried. Others stood in stunned silence. Hilda sat at the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands. What did surrender mean for people who had already lost everything? What did it mean to be free when you no longer knew who you were? She picked up a pencil and a fresh piece of paper. This time, the words came more easily. She wrote to her sister. She wrote to the niece she had never met. She wrote about the heat of Texas, about the stars that looked too big, about the American nurse who returned her mirror. And she wrote about the lipstick, not as something beautiful, but as something defiant and difficult and true. In her final lines, she wrote, "I hope one day we can teach our daughters that dignity is not given by governments or uniforms. It is chosen, quietly, in moments when no one is watching, even in the darkest places." She folded the letter and held it for a moment before handing it over for mailing. That evening, she stood outside the barracks and watched the wind move through the dry grass. A few women walked by, some with faces bare, others with a touch of color on their lips. Not all would understand. Not all would agree. But some had chosen to remember that being human was not something granted by war or taken by shame. It was something claimed again and again, even after everything else had been lost.